City of Port Washington, Ozaki, City of Port Washington Special Common Council work session for tonight. It's Tuesday, June 10th, 2025. It's 5 o'clock. All alder persons are present with the exception of Alderman Newmeyer, who is excused. Tonight is an opportunity for the council to learn about TIFs and TIDs and what their impact is and what they are, what the rules are, et cetera. Tonight is a special meeting of the council. There is no public comments, and this is a presentation only where no action or decisions will be made. This is just our opportunity as a council to learn about TIDs and TIFs because we're a newer council together and making sure that we're going in with our eyes wide open. So we've got two consultants with us tonight who have prepared a presentation, and I've asked them to get through their entire presentation before we interrupt them with questions. Just as a teacher, I always know we start asking questions and then it's the next slide. So we'll give you the opportunity to get through there and then answer those questions. Tonight is a stratospheric level overview of what TIFs and TIDs are. We're not getting into any what ifs or how about if it was this much or what type of a deal should we make. That is not our intention at all tonight. This is an education opportunity for us publicly so that we can have that kind of a conversation. Any clarifications from council on the objective for tonight? We're good to go? All right, well, with that, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but Chris and Todd, welcome to Port Washington. Chris again, and Todd, welcome, and we'll switch over to your presentation. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. So just to introduce myself, I know the council has met me before. I've been at your meetings before, but my name is Chris Smith. I am an attorney at Von Briesen and Roper. I am one of the chairs of our real estate section. I have a lot of experience in deals involving TIDs and development agreements. I was involved and authored the development agreement for the Microsoft data center in 2023. And Todd Taves, to my left here, is a senior municipal advisor with Ehlers. Ehlers is a consulting firm that assists municipalities with TID financing, development agreements, and Todd also was the consultant on the Microsoft deal and has great knowledge of these issues. We put together a relatively brief slideshow for what can be a dense topic, but we're going to try to talk about it from a high enough level that it's understandable. I understand that there's many people in this room that will hear a lot of the things we have to say and think, yeah, this is basic stuff. I know this stuff. But for the benefit of people who may not understand how a TID works and people who may be watching this on YouTube, we're going to make sure we cover the basics. So that's enough of... I think I'm wearing the same shirt as I did in that picture a couple of years ago. It's a good choice. All right. So, and Todd's going to chime in. There's times that I'm going to just say, Todd, you might be better to explain this concept or that, but Todd's going to feel free to chime in whenever he wants. But the way I think about a TID is it does two primary things. It keeps the costs associated with a specific project away from the rest of the city and contained within the TID. It also keeps the revenue generated within those boundaries within the TID to pay for those costs. So it's a way to shield the rest of the community or the municipality from any project costs. And the idea is the revenue generated from that project through property taxes covers those costs within the boundaries of the TID. State legislature has given municipalities the ability to create these districts for that purpose. And you see this chart up here, and the thing that I like to point out, which is a very common misconception and just misunderstanding of the way TID works, is what we call the base value of the property contained within the TID. And what that means is, and this kind of cuts against where a lot of people say, Well, when you create a TID, all that tax value, that property tax value, you're cutting off the other taxing jurisdictions like the school district, the technical college district, and the county, not to mention the city's general fund. And that is true to an extent. When you create the TID, one of the benefits of the TID as far as generating revenue to pay for project costs within that boundary is that instead of the city capturing a slice of the tax revenue, the city gets to the TID gets to capture all 100% of that tax revenue. And the school district and the technical college district and the county and any other taxing jurisdiction forgoes that tax revenue. And by the way, to create a TID, the Joint Review Board, which is made up of representatives from all those jurisdictions, have to vote in favor to create the TID. But to say that, well, we're screwing those other taxing jurisdictions by creating the TID, I would not agree with, because the base value, which is the value that is generated at the time the TID is created, so the property taxes that are flowing to all those taxing jurisdictions when the TID is created, that continues throughout the life of the TID. So whatever the school district was collecting, whatever the technical college was collecting, whatever the county and the city was collecting from those parcels continue to be collected. That is never interrupted. The only thing that those other taxing jurisdictions don't get a cut of during the life of the TID is the new value created by the project. Then, once the TID closes, of course, you have a new higher value, and that flows to all the taxing jurisdictions. Did I miss anything, Todd?
No, the only thing I would add, Chris, as part and parcel with this, the whole premise is the other taxing jurisdictions are not losing those incremental taxes, the purple portion, because in fact, the project that's contemplated would not happen without the creation of the TIF district. So in other words, if the TIF wasn't created, those incremental taxes would not be there to begin with. So again, base value property taxes continue to flow to the taxing jurisdictions, and it's just the incremental taxes that are diverted for the life of the district or until project costs are paid off.
So another way to look at this chart or graph or whatever you'd like to call it, graphic, is without the TID, that blue line, which is collected by all the taxing jurisdictions, would keep going. Maybe it would come up very slowly as property values increase, but the substantial increase only happens with the project, and that only happens with the TID. So for the project that we're all here, interested in, just to give people an idea what we're talking about is for the entire quote unquote project area that we've seen publicized, almost 2,000 acres, the tax revenue generated from 2024 was just over $16,000. Okay. And that gets frozen. That's what all the taxing jurisdictions will get. And that's what they'll continue to get until this TID would be closed. This 16,000 some dollars will not be retained by the TID, but will instead continue to be distributed to the city, county, the other taxing jurisdictions, school district, and technical college. So when I say we're shielding the rest of the community from costs, what are those costs? Okay, what are we talking about? And the costs that we're talking about here are essentially, at least in my mind, exactly what using a TID is perfect for. Because you have an area, a project area that does not have municipal water and sewer and needs public roads. Because we're talking about agricultural land. So this is all public infrastructure that the city does not have the ability to pay for. And so there is a way, working with a development agreement and a company, to finance that. And when I say finance that, there's a number of ways of doing it, but the way that I think we're headed in Port Washington is that the company will pay for that. But some many people would say, well, why would a company pay for things that ultimately are going to be the property of the village or some other public entity? Because that's how it would work. And that's where the TID financing will come in, which I'll get to on the next slide. But I want to talk about these costs. Okay, what are the costs that we're talking about when I say we draw this boundary and the costs, we don't want to have these costs on the general levy, on the general taxpayers, and stay within the TID. So we're talking about installation of things like water, sewer, roads, things that are public but maybe not, or quasi-public, like transmission lines, things like that, okay? These are costs that need to be incurred to make the project go, okay? What are some other costs that the city would have, okay? We entered in an agreement with the town of Port Washington in late 2024. We are obligated to pay certain things and do certain things pursuant to that agreement. We are obligated to pay the town a certain amount for 5 years after the annexation, so starting in 2026. And that's $133,800, but when you add in some other costs that are per statute, it comes to $150,000 a year for 5 years. That's a cost, okay? Other costs, city, as we all have discussed, internal city staff have full-time jobs. They do not have the time or the bandwidth to devote the substantial amount of time that it takes to put a project like this together. So the city has to have outside consultants, outside legal, outside finance, outside engineering, experienced people, but they need to be brought in, and those people need to get paid. And that's another cost that this project will require. So how are they paid? Anything I missed on costs, Todd? Okay. How can they be paid? Okay. Now, different municipalities have done different things over the years. Sometimes municipalities borrow and then pay themselves back through the property tax revenue that is generated by the project. That new property tax revenue is what we call increment or incremental revenue. So going back to this slide, that purple triangle, which is the new tax revenue that we get from the property taxes from the project, is what we call incremental revenue, tax increment. So once the project starts to generate this new value, now you can pay the cost back. I think the preferred way to do it, if you can find a development partner, a company, an end user that would agree to it and has the bandwidth to do it, is to have the company pay for all of these costs and then reimburse them for those costs through their own tax revenue. That way the city is not having to go through the bonding process and taking the risk of borrowing. Anything to add there, Todd? And all of these terms and provisions are found in a development agreement. So for example, if we were able to come to terms, for the latter example that I gave in the development agreement, which is a contract between the city and the company, it would say, here are the costs that the company must absorb, and here are the things they must do. And once the company starts to generate this increment, then they would be eligible to get reimbursed for what they paid for that type of infrastructure from their own tax revenue. Then what happens? Well, when those costs are paid, you can close the TID. And at that point, Todd, I'll let you explain what happens.
Sure. So, there were some changes that came about as part of Act 12, which was the act in the legislature last session that increased local government aid. So as I talk about what happens at TID closure, just understand that we're now operating with a little different set of rules. that apply prospectively to TIDs created going forward. How your existing TIDs benefit the city when they close is a little bit different. So I just wanted to make that clear. And I'm going to just more broadly talk about how growth within TIDs impacts levy limits, because that kind of then dovetails into closure. So under the law, the city is limited to an increase in its annual levy that's equal to your net new construction. There is no distinction whether net new construction happens within or without a TID. So in other words, development wherever it occurs will provide you a net new construction allowance and ability to raise the levy. Under Act 12, if property is within the TID, the only distinction, and this was part of a political compromise to get that, to get all the benefits of Act 12 passed, is the net new construction that occurs in the TID is prorated. You receive 90% of the benefit of that as it occurs, and then that residual 10% is what you get at closure. So in other words, when you reach the end of the TID life, that accumulated 10%, that has grown through the life of the district, you get a one-time adjustment at closure, so you'll get a bit of a bump in the levy limit when the TID closes. But what will also happen is you will have this big infusion of value. And what will happen is your tax rate will drop significantly. At this point, we're kind of talking in general terms. Hypothetically, I think we all understand that there's a capacity to have substantial amount of value within this district. So it's kind of hard to say that rate would go from this to this at this point. But once we understand what that valuation potential is, we can actually quantify that. The other thing I would say, and this is something Mount Pleasant contends with as well, is while you have all this net new construction, you also need to be able to take into consideration the impact of using that on your property tax levy. So it's kind of a balancing act. You'll have that ability to raise the levy, but you also need to take into consideration how much can you raise the levy without putting an undue burden on property taxpayers. There is a provision within the law that does allow you to float that for up to 5 years. So there is an ability to smooth that out to some degree. But in short, the TID closure aspect is going to result in a tax rate drop, because now you're going to have the city's general levy being absorbed by a much larger tax base, and so that's spread out then amongst all the property taxpayers and would cause property taxes to go down significantly for a typical property owner.
So another way to think about that is you have your annual budget, and that budget is a certain amount, right, to keep the city running, do whatever projects you're doing, keep police and fire, waste disposal, all that stuff, right? Then every property that's not exempt from property taxes within the city has to pay the same rate per $1,000 of value. So whether it's a $2,000 property or a $1 million property, for every $1,000, they're paying about $16 in taxes, okay? So when the TID closes, if you have a $1 billion property, that's quite of an infusion to help spread out those expenses, okay? And what we're seeing from our modeling and analyzing of what's happening in Mount Pleasant with Microsoft, because they're not finished with even their first building yet, and their 2025 assessment just for the buildings in their first phase, even though not one is completed yet, is $800 million. So we're talking about significant value. And what's going to happen is that the tax rate is going to drop significantly. Now, sometimes you have a high value project like a data center, but it's not a data center, it's a manufacturer, okay? And they require thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs to operate. So you have an infusion of tens of thousands of people coming into the community. Well, when you have that many new people, you have to increase your services, right? You need more police, you need more fire, you need more everything. So your budget goes up, proportionately to this influx of people. The thing about the data center that we're learning is that that's not the case. So you have a disproportionate amount of property tax being paid in relation to the amount of services that are needed, municipal services, which is a benefit. So a question that we've gotten is, how long will this TID be open? And Todd, why don't you explain what the normal TID length is for something like this and when we can know we can close it?
So, again, this will kind of depend as we get into the modeling, get into the deal points, but under statute, a TID must close at either at the earlier of the end of its maximum life or at the point that you've recovered your project costs. And so whether this could close at 12 years, at 14 years, at 18 years is just going to depend on, again, the types of costs that Chris talked about that end up needing to be paid for, how much tax increment we're going to generate, and then it's just a mathematical calculation of how long it will take to pay off that cost of those improvements. Oftentimes, as with any projections, we find out that the projections going in aren't always, perfect. So it also is a matter of annual monitoring. In some cases, we will see a TID generate far more increment that was anticipated and be able to close earlier than originally projected. In some cases, it may take an extra year or two. But I don't know that I could say that, the average TID closes in X years, because every TID is very specific to the nature of the development, the extent of the costs. It would be rare to see a TID, a 20-year TID probably close in less than 10 years. And many of them do run, the entire course of that 20 years. Again, very, very project specific, very deal specific.
So really the two factors that we will need to know before we can start predicting how many years before this TID closes is, what are the amount of the costs that need to be covered, and what is the amount of the value, and when will that value hit of the project? Because the higher the value, the more they're paying in property taxes, the quicker we can retire these costs. And I've heard, I've had a number of questions about, well, okay, let's say this thing goes 20 years. How does that help us? We need help now with our tax base. We have a completely skewed, unfair burden on residential in this city, and 20 years, what's that going to do for us? And the first thing I would say to that is, if in 2005 the Common Council had this opportunity, wouldn't you be pretty happy right now with that TID closing? So just because it's something beneficial to you in the future, doesn't mean that's a negative. That's a positive. But we do have some ways to benefit the financial situation of the city, even with doing a project in a TID like this. There are ways that we are currently exploring of when you have a big development like this that will very likely include a number of buildings, and each of those buildings are in the hundreds of millions of dollars in value. There may be a way to take a portion of it and, rather than trap those funds within the TID, pass them through to the taxing jurisdictions, including the city, as if it weren't in the TID. And so we're looking at a way to do that. Fortunately, when you have a project such as this, and the value is so substantial, and there's multiple components to it, you have that flexibility, which oftentimes you just don't. I mean, you're talking about a single warehouse or a single building that you can't split up. But I think there'll be opportunities for that here potentially. And Todd, I'll let you handle that last bullet point here.
And I think that's just kind of goes back to that earlier comment I made. So you will get the benefit, or at least 90% of the benefit of the net new construction that occurs in the TID as it happens. Again, the challenge will be those percentage increases could be pretty significant. And so, even though you have it available, it may not be practical to take it, or at least take it as it occurs. That may need to be spread out. It may need to be deferred. Again, there's a 5-year rollover, which isn't a extremely long period of time. But one of the things I mentioned to Chris too, as you think of creative solutions, and there certainly are other communities, namely Mount Pleasant, that is in the same situation, and I suspect there will be others as time goes on. Where perhaps a legislative solution to address this, concern of having too much net new construction too quickly and being able to leverage that into the future instead of when it occurs. So, what I would say to Chris's point is our goal is always to look for a way to close the TID as quickly as possible and to provide the maximum benefit not only to the municipality but to the various taxing jurisdictions. Another opportunity you do have is if there's a possibility to exclude certain properties from the TID, that is one option at the onset. But another is you do have the ability to remove territory from a TID even after you've created it. So again, this kind of gets into that monitoring. We do projections, but as things actually unfold, you may make a determination that you could remove part of the value from the TID, still have sufficient cash flow to pay off project costs within the desired amount of time, and then provide, again, some immediate tax base that the taxing jurisdictions can tax across. So there are tools in the current law, and I think, we always want to be looking at other tools that would be beneficial, especially in circumstances like this, which, the TIF law, the way it's designed to operate really didn't contemplate projects of this kind of magnitude. So I think some accommodation is certainly another alternative to look at.
Yeah, and it's just a little bit of a balancing act, because if you think about it, the purpose of the TID is to pay for these project costs. Whoever incurs them, whether it's the company or the municipality, the idea is the money that's coming in through property tax payments for the project within the TID pays those off. And we want that to be paid off as quickly as possible so we can close the TID. The company wants it paid off as quickly as possible so they can get reimbursed. But the more we carve out of that to give that immediate or short-term benefit to the city, the longer the payoff will take, right? Because you're taking a little chunk out of the total incremental revenues to flow immediately to the city and the school district and the other taxing jurisdictions. But I think, again, because of the flexibility you have due to the scope and size and the substantial value that a project like this would contemplate, you have an ability to make that work. So those are the slides. We tried to, again, not bore you to death with, words like incremental revenues and things like that, but also hopefully educate a little bit on this idea. I received and I shared with Todd some questions that we received from council members prior to this. Some of the questions might have been answered here, but Todd, do you want me to read them off and then you and I can answer them?
We could certainly do that if.
Yep, that'd be wonderful.
Okay. Do you want me to read them or do you want to?
Whatever you prefer.
All right, I can read them. That way if I find
Do you
one I
need
don't
them?
like, I can skip it.
There you go.
Just the second list.
All right. If and when a TID is established, will the base value be based on its current value as farmland residential? The answer would be yes, current value. Right, Todd?
So from a timing perspective, we would most probably create this district with a January 1st, 2026 base value. And so, again, without knowing the specifics of each parcel, the ownership, land transactions, current zoning, I mean, all I would be able to say is the assessor, which the assessor has to follow certain uniform practices on putting value on property. It would be whatever the value of that property is on that date. So if it was still in, ag preservation, something of that nature, it would be assessed as ag, could potentially be assessed as development land, but that would be the best person to answer that question would be the city assessor.
Yeah, another way to say it is if the TID is created prior to October 1st, then the effective date of the TID is January 1, 2025, so it's retroactive. Right. If that would be the case, then the current value, which is the base value, is similar to what I talked about because we know what those assessments are. I mean, there's border review, so they could change a little bit, but we have a pretty good idea. If it's created after October 1st, then as Todd said, January 1st, 2026 is the effective date of the TID. And then you have to look at what is the assessed value of that date. And like Todd said, that would be up to the assessor. The assessments would come out sometime in 2026 in the first half of the year. And then we'd find out what the base value is then. What effect will the likely length of the project have on the development of the increment which finances our costs? Will we be borrowing against future increment to finance the necessary improvements? Again, I think we're too early to say exactly. I've told you what, my preferred route would be, and I think Todd's too, would be if you have a company that can have the capacity to basically be the bank, meaning they finance everything, they pay for everything, and they can just get reimbursed and cut us out of the financing anything, that's the preferred route. There are other routes that many municipalities have done where the municipality borrows and then they pay themselves back. But we just don't know at this point until we really sit down and talk about a development agreement with the company on where that's going to go.
Yeah, the other thing I might add on that, Chris, is even in a situation hypothetically where the city was financing, the way I was understanding that question, are we going to incur a liability with the hope that something will happen 5 years or 10 years down the road in terms of the phasing? And so within the construct of a development agreement, you normally have triggers, with the idea being that in order to pay debt service or another obligation, you've got to have that increment there. So there's going to be timing in terms of when the trigger gets pulled on projects so they correspond with the phasing for things that have to be done on the front end. That's where you would look at some form of guarantee from the company that ensures that if tax increment isn't sufficient, that there would be a payment made in the amount of the shortfall. So those are all types of things that you mitigate in a development agreement, but we would never want a situation where we're incurring an obligation without any sort of certainty that we're going to have the revenue to pay that.
Did you need to ask a question?
I do.
Okay, but before you do, I just want to remind council to be very cautious about editorializing at all about anything in their questions or comments, to not put us in a poor position to negotiate down the road by announcing your own personal position or what your thoughts are in this conversation. So just a caution.
I agree. No one on the council should say, let's just give them anything they want. That would not be good for negotiations.
Yeah, that's highly unlikely. Jonathan, thank you.
Should the end user decide to finance the TIF themselves, does that, if you go to slide 4, Chris, maybe it's easier to show it that way. If the company decides to, let's see, maybe one, keep going, back up, that one, yep. If the company decides to finance the TID, does that change what can be financed with a TID on this list? Okay, just to be clear.
Good question.
Thank you.
It doesn't matter who's putting the money up front.
Okay.
As far as what costs can be paid for.
Thank you.
And there is another question. I think I'll just read that now because it's right on point to what you say. And the question is, what what can the TID pay for? Okay. And my answer to that is it's broad in the law. As long as you identify it when you're creating the TID, and that's something Todd and his firm does, is helps with the documents to create the TID. And you have to have something called the project plan. And the project plan has to be approved by the council, has to be approved by the Joint Review Board, which again is made up by all these different taxing jurisdictions. And if a cost is identified in the project plan, then it can be used. It can potentially be paid for through the increment that's generated. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very short section in the statute on what you can't pay for, namely municipal buildings and general administrative costs. But beyond that, as Chris indicated, is extremely broad. It just has to be related to the implementation of the project. So there's got to be a nexus between the expenditure and the necessity of that expenditure to make the project happen. And there's also an ability to prorate in some cases if there's a benefit beyond just the TID project. The TID pays its proportionate share.
And I do believe a lot of the questions that we received have been covered. But if when we're done going through this, you don't feel like yours is, or you have other questions from the council, please speak up. But I'm going to go to, maybe Todd, you can talk about the half-mile rule of expenditures.
So in addition to the ability to incur project costs within the district's boundary, there's a couple ways that money can be spent outside of the district. So the TIF law has always had a provision where municipal utility costs, so water, sanitary, sewer, stormwater management, if those improvements are needed at some point, at some place in the city that's not within the boundaries of the TID, that is eligible, again, as long as it's necessitated by the TID. So when we're talking about utilities, the geography really isn't relevant because, as we know, utilities don't always go necessarily within the neat boundaries of a district. For non-utility projects, there's a provision that allows you to make an expenditure within 1/2 mile of the boundary of the TID, but also within the limits of the city. So you can't spend money outside of city boundaries. But this would be, for example, if you had, if there was going to be traffic considerations and you needed to make street improvements, intersection improvements, and it didn't happen to be in the TID, but was, a 1/4 mile away, that could be an eligible project cost, again, as long as that corollary benefit.
Chris, could you just explain in the bill that we worked with the Assembly and the Senate on, they put in a provision on TID 5 here, if it comes to fruition, that there's a certain thing that we cannot do in that TID.
You're talking about
The donor TID. Can you just explain that, please? Because we agreed to that.
Generally, when a municipality creates a TID and that TID is cash flowing, meaning it's building a fund balance and it's doing well, a municipality is allowed to take the funds from that good TID and fund another TID within the city. But there's legislation that's working its way through the state legislature that would prohibit Port Washington from doing that. Similar legislation applies to Mount Pleasant. So I think what the state is trying to do there, and I think it's consistent with what we want, is, close the TID as soon as possible. Because if you didn't have that prohibition, I think there's a lot of people who would say, wait a second, let's create TIDs all over and just fund it from this substantial tax revenue and do every project we could ever think of. But again, I think the legislature is saying, no, we want you to close that TID so the other taxing jurisdictions can start to get the benefit here. Another question, which I'm going to direct towards Todd, is when a TID exists, does the TID capture the inflationary value of the parcels within it, even while the levy limit cannot increase with inflation?
Yes, it does.
That was simple. How do we evaluate whether a TID merely pays itself off versus being a good value investment for the city? Parenthetical, the TIF produces more revenue in the long term compared to what would happen without it. So I think that goes to, a firm like Eller's will do modeling. Once we would have an idea of the revenue, the incremental revenue that's created versus the costs, and what the impact will be from a revenue perspective once the TID closes. And then you could look at, okay, well, what could we have expected from that base value without this project, and then compare the two? Would you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the cash flow proposition that the district has got to be able to recover its costs. But, back to the concept of the joint review board, the statute is actually a three-pronged test. We tend to sort of lump that all together and just say but for, and that's really one of the prongs, that the development would not occur without the use of tax increment financing. But the other two are the cash flow. But then lastly, the taxing jurisdictions need to find that, beyond just the property tax revenue, that all of the economic benefits of the project outweigh that investment of the tax revenue for the life of the district. So we're talking about, purchase of commodities and supplies from the local and regional economy, employment, upgraded infrastructure, so really anything that is an economic benefit. So I always like to think about these types of projects. We kind of focus in on the tax revenue because that's how TIF works. But when we're thinking about economic benefit, we want to broaden that and think about all of the various aspects and what it does economically for the city as well as the other taxing jurisdictions.
Just for our own clarification, you guys are you're saying TIF and TID, same thing?
They get thrown around interchangeably. TID is tax incremental district. It's the geographical area. TIF, tax incremental financing, is the taxing mechanism, the capture of the incremental taxes to repay project costs.
I had a question from an alderman that says, would this TID/TIF, he used both, be considered pay-as-you-go? And so far, every example I gave to you, the answer would be yes. So pay-as-you-go is a term that we use, or a phrase that we use, to capture the idea that the only thing that we're using to pay costs or reimburse the developer is the money that they generate. So they capture those funds on the back end. There's other permitted ways to do TIF, and some communities may decide that they're going to borrow up front and give a cash grant to the developer, and then they get themselves paid back, over time. But of the examples I gave to you today, they would be both pay-as-you-go. What is the estimated cost of outside consultant fees? A lot. We should be expecting to incur and charge to the TID. So it's hard to say what it'll be. I will tell you that for the Microsoft project, with all the costs put together that the village used, we exceeded $750,000. But again, that is a fee that ultimately is going to be paid through the company's tax revenue. Again, if you recall, the very first time I spoke to you in an open session, I said my primary job in this whole situation was to ensure that the city is not spending any money on outside costs for this project. So that means legal fees, outside financial consultants, outside engineering, even communications consultants. And so we have put in place already a pre-development agreement that has made sure that the city is being reimbursed for every penny for those types of fees, and that would be a necessary provision in a development agreement as well. Next question, there's only two more here that I think I have, and then if I missed any or you have other questions, we'll open it up with your permission, Mayor, to the council. While the TID will result in a short-term drastically higher net new construction value, what does this mean for subsequent years and how the city finances its GO and CIP budgets? when the net new construction goes back to very low single digits? That sounds like a Todd question.
So this goes back a little bit to the earlier conversation about the net new construction potentially being so much in a short period of time that you really can't leverage it all. In the question, it referenced GO-debt and the CIP. So GO-debt payments are always exempt from levy limits. So I don't see that there's a direct linkage there, other than potentially that net new construction allowance might allow you to make some strategic decisions on harnessing that and using the increased cash from the levy to avoid some additional debt. So that's kind of a matter of analysis and doing some planning. But yeah, again, the part of the question about when it goes back down, that really does get into this, this essentially 5-year sunset you have to either leverage it or it goes away on the levy limit worksheet, at least under current law. So I guess the best thing I can say is that using the tools you have right now and the current law, and again, once some modeling is done, you kind of forecast that out. You do some projections of if this much value is established in this year, we think we could raise the levy by this much. What does that mean for the average taxpayer? And then kind of gauging that and saying, well, that's too much, but we could live with this. Maybe we want to take some of that levy capacity and use that to buy capital equipment with cash financing where we may have borrowed for it, which maybe raises the levy a little bit in the shorter term, but longer term avoids that interest expense. So all these things really just entail thinking about what your options are and the planning. But again, you do have that 5-year horizon under current law to take advantage of that net new construction.
And Todd, I appreciate you continually repeating under current law.
Yeah.
Council and I think the community needs to know that, we're going to be working with Mount Pleasant and several legislators as well as approaching WEDC and the governor's office of, you can't position Port Washington to be in a spot where the only way we can do this is at the expense of the homeowners while we're waiting for this to happen. So looking for that flexibility as well as that net new construction flexibility once it is all closed out, if that's the direction we go, because if this is billions and billions of dollars, it's billions of dollars of net new construction in order for the city to keep up with CPI costs in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and that's not fair. So we have to do something about that, and we're going to make sure that we consider that in this whole conversation and negotiation. So thanks for bringing that up.
Certainly.
So the last question is, in past developers agreements with TID/TIFs included, the city has put in protective language. Will this developers agreement need stronger language to protect the city and its taxpayers? So I think what this question is getting at, and Jonathan, you can correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting this, but it's about risk. And the negotiation for the developer's agreement for this project, and really any developer's agreement, and really any contract, is about who's taking the risk, or what is the share of the risk here. And when a community finances these costs, they're taking a risk, right? Because what if the company just disappears, right? So there are provisions that are commonly used in development agreements to protect against those risks. And the main provision is what we call a minimum guaranteed value, okay? And when a city is borrowing to fund these costs, the city has to ensure that the revenue coming in from the project is going to be able to pay that debt back, right? And the company says, well, don't worry. We're going to build this and this and this, and you're going to have so much property revenue, you're not going to have any issues paying this debt back. But what if they don't? Okay? And if they don't, then you have a mechanism in the developer's agreement that's called a minimum guaranteed value. And a absolutely perfect example of this is what happened in Mount Pleasant with Foxconn. And people say, oh my God, what a boondoggle. Everyone got screwed down there, but actually the development agreement worked exactly how it was intended to work. Because in that case, it wasn't just the village, but the city and the state financed the costs of that project, which were substantial, almost $1 billion in costs for all the infrastructure that needed to be put in for over 2,000 acres or about 2,000 acres of infrastructure costs. And so Todd and his firm calculated exactly what type of revenue that project would need to generate so we could service the debt on those costs, okay? And Todd figured out that by 2023, Foxconn would need to generate $1.4 billion in property tax value because the amount of property tax revenue or increment paid from that 1.4 billion would cover the costs. We'd be fine. Okay? Well, everybody knows that Foxconn did not build what they said they were going to build at the start. Things changed, they shifted gears, and they ended up building only $600 million of value, which most municipalities would say, well, that's a pretty big project, okay? But when you compare it to the expectations, you're not even halfway there. But in the developer's agreement, there was a clause that said, look, you can build $1.4 billion worth of value. That'd be great. That's what we want. But if you don't build anything, you're paying taxes on it regardless. And that's what they've done. So every year they get their assessment. Their assessment now is around $600 million. So they pay that tax bill. Then they get an extra bill from the village saying, here's your shortfall or makeup payment. They paid it every year. Okay? So other protections with that is you need to make sure that the company is good for that, right? Because a lot of these companies come in and say, you know what? Yeah, we're just pick a company, a blue chip company. I mean, we're Microsoft, but our development here is Microsoft Wisconsin LLC, which has, no assets or anything like that. So we make sure as a protection there to get the parent company on the hook. If it's a smaller development, we may ask a developer, and this wouldn't be the case here, but we'd ask the developer to go get a bond to cover a default. So those are the protections. Now, if we had what I would call the dream scenario, which is city is not putting any financing out there, city is not paying for any costs up front, company is agreeing to cover everything, then, you don't need that. Because if they default, they're not getting paid back from their own increment. And so that's how, hopefully that answers your question. That's where you were going with it. So I covered all the questions that we received. The one, at least I had more, but I think we covered them in our presentation. Any other questions from the council?
We have a couple minutes left. Todd, if you could for us explain why a TID in economic development? Why does a community even have to do that? What's the purpose or intent there?
Of why TID is utilized?
Got to be competitive in the process.
So I'll talk maybe a little bit about this specific situation in a minute, but broadly speaking, we're doing a lot of TIF for housing right now, and the fundamental issue there is cost of construction is up, cost of capital is up. But if you were to just say, well, these are the rents we would have to charge to make the project provide investment returns that would allow it to get done, people couldn't afford to pay the rent. So it's really about filling a gap. So when we're looking at sort of the traditional residential projects, maybe a medical office building, a commercial building, there's a gap that's just created by what the economy is doing. With a large project like this, it's typically the competitive nature of it. In other words, The reality is these projects will go where it is most attractive for them from a business proposition. That's why you don't see projects like this get done without assistance from the state that they're in, the local municipalities. But the other thing is there's obviously a tremendous amount of cost. So if a company had to bear all the cost of utility infrastructure, road infrastructure, that's going to make that site much less attractive to other places it may be looking, especially if there's assistance available. So it's really bringing what you can to the table to try to make it the best location or the best choice for that company, but while also making sure that you're not over-investing and that you're mitigating any risk that you may have in the deal. And as Chris talked about, risk profile goes down tremendously, and things are much simpler when we're not bringing any upfront capital to the table. So that's the ideal circumstance.
And I know the answer to this question, but I don't know that everyone knows the answer to this question. What are the other economic development tools that a city like Port Washington would have, if not a TID or a TIF?
Well, you really don't have any.
Well, I mean, do you have a very rich benefactor that can just donate
Yeah,
$10 million?
Mr. Washington passed away a long time ago.
So,
Yeah, unfortunately, Wisconsin municipalities have a very small toolbox in many ways. We're reliant on property taxes. TID is our only economic development tool. We don't have tax abatement in Wisconsin. We don't have other revenue streams that can be harnessed as part of a TIF construct. In some cases, in some states, there are sales tax TIFs. So we just don't have the tools in Wisconsin. If you're going to make something happen, if a project needs something to get it to the finish line, there are very little resources other than tax increment financing.
Thank you. Other questions from council or inquiries? Yeah, Mr. Pleitner.
If I may, kind of during the discussion, we kind of talked about pulling things in and out of the TID depending on paying back early or the length of the district, the financing. Can that be done in real time? Does it have to be done at the time of the developer's agreement? How does that process work about how do you make those decisions?
we would certainly need a provision in the developer's agreement to allow us to do that. Because if we didn't have that negotiated up front, you have a company that is expecting to be reimbursed for these costs that we talked about, and then we're saying, you know what, we're just going to shrink this TID down, and what you thought you were going to get paid back isn't going to be anywhere near on the timeline where you would, or you may not get paid back altogether. So I think it's something that can be handled in the development agreement. There could be some flexibility there. There could be, the city has the option to remove an area from the district, once this level of value is hit, or, this number of buildings is built, or things like that. But it would have to be in the development agreement.
The other thing I would mention that I think I was reading in one of the questions we may not have hit on directly is the idea that do you kind of phase the creation of the TIF. So the TIF is going to have to encompass the entire development site out of the gate for the simple reason that you've got a legislative exception pending that will allow you to do that. As development occurs, you're going to continue to be over that limit. So anything that is contemplated as being part of the project area will have to go in at the onset. So we're really talking about potential flexibility to remove later on.
And the other reason, I'm glad you brought that up, Ty, because I did miss that question. The other reason you want the whole area in there rather than trying to create different TIDs for different phases is because, like I said before, the city wants the TID to close as fast as possible. The company wants the TID to close as fast as possible. We want the cost to be paid as fast as possible. So if you were to, for phase 2, create a new TID, now you can't use the increment from phase 1 against those costs. Like you want to throw as much as you can at the costs to get it paid as fast as possible.
And those dollars are part of the valuation that are paid annually, just not releasable until it's all cleared and put out.
Right.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming tonight, and we appreciate that. This is our first night of learning, but it's not our first night of discussions on this topic as we move forward. And just for our guests and the community as they're watching, in the next few months, we'll begin the conversations around these developer agreements as, you know, a clear picture on end user comes, and we can figure out what we're going to do there. Council will have a lot of opportunities to have input into that conversation, negotiations, and if we have more questions, we'll bring them back to do again tonight. But I think we all heard kind of loud and clear for some of the lessons learned to the south in Mount Pleasant, that we want the risk 100% on the company, we want guarantees, and we want no cost to the city, and those are things that are very possible to do. So thank you very much for your time tonight. And then with that, is there any other questions? Otherwise, we are going to adjourn and turn this room over to Public Works. Thank you, everybody. I don't need a motion to adjourn. Nope, we are adjourned.